Hello, good morning and welcome. It's Monday, March the 16th. Keir Starmer will address the nation this morning and he'll explain why he's resisting Donald Trump's call to send a British warship to reopen the Straits of Hormuz and respond to the president's angry blast at the decision. My name is Anne McElvoy from Politico.
And I'm Sam Coates of Sky News. In that address in Downing Street today, the Prime Minister will say ending the war is the quickest way to reduce the cost of living, as Britain readies mine-hunting drones and anti-drone weapons, specifically the Octopus Interceptor anti-drone systems, which are currently being produced for Ukraine to use against Russia, to send to the Straits of Hormuz.
But this doesn't involve, at least as it stands, sending our aircraft carrier or other warships to the region. On Saturday, Trump said that he hoped the UK, with China, France, Japan and South Korea, would send ships to the area so that the Straits of Hormuz would no longer be a threat. After a phone call between the president and the Prime Minister last night, Trump made his anger plain.
Donald Trump used an interview with the Financial Times to link the lack of assistance that allies are sending to America side in the Straits of Hormuz to other military help that America offers, saying the decision meant a very bad future for NATO. In the interview with the FT, which dropped a couple of hours before this podcast records, he said, "It's only appropriate that people who are the beneficiaries of the Strait will help to make sure that nothing bad happens there." He also said that Europe and China are heavily dependent on oil from the Gulf, so should be taking part. If there's no response, or if it's a negative response, I think it will be very bad for the future of NATO, he added.
And in the interview, he also went further, singling out Britain for criticism. The UK, he said, might be considered the number one ally, the longest serving, etc. And when I asked for them to come, they didn't want to come. And he added, as soon as we basically wiped out the danger capacity from Iran, they said, oh, well, we'll send 2 ships. And I said, we need these ships before we win, not after we win. He then goes on to say that NATO is a one-way street, and he seems to be suggesting, Sam, that this is proof that Britain behaves in that one-way street kind of way. Officials told The Guardian sending the ships might worsen the situation, given how volatile it is, but it does show, doesn't it, how the Atlantic is widening on this point.
That's absolutely right. I think Keir Starmer will try this morning in his number 10 press conference to in some way present the widening gap between him and Donald Trump as a political positive, suggesting he's getting the politics of this right and will be proved right by the decisions that he's made. Government sources were telling me overnight that the decision not to send the aircraft carrier, the Prince of Wales, for now, was part of a coordinated effort with other European allies who are all jointly very concerned that they meet the challenge of all threats, not just the one that we can see most prominently in Iran. And this goes to the heart of the fact that there is a concern amongst Britain and its allies about what Russia is up to right now. Russia, arguably one of the biggest beneficiaries, both financially and politically, from what's going on. There's a particular concern amongst Britain and its allies that the singular focus on Iran might leave NATO exposed in the high north and give some greater latitude to Russia there, which is the biggest beneficiary, both financially from what's going on in Iran and also arguably politically as the focus shifts away from the actions of President Putin. One official telling me that the UK is working with allies to make sure we send the right stuff to the right place. It's unclear whether the discussions loop in America, but the US president, very, very clear, he's not happy with us.
And I think one part of the interview that will be worrying for number 10 and for the European allies in general is Trump comparing US help for Ukraine with global assistance over Iran in a kind of tit-for-tat way. We didn't have to help them with Ukraine. He says Ukraine's thousands of miles from us, but we helped them. Well, up to a point. But yeah, he says that we've been there for Ukraine. They won't be there for us and those who help Ukraine. And I think it just sounds a bit like this is sounding a bit like a trade. And if he can't get what he wants from the UK over the Gulf, then it's a bit like using Ukraine as a bargaining chip. And that must surely be in the minds of John Healey and others this morning.
It's such a pivot, isn't it, from a prime minister who made a virtue of his closeness to Donald Trump for so many months now, to be having to sort of make a virtue of the distance. It's tricky stuff. None of this eases the looming cost of living crisis. As we record this podcast, the price of oil is a little over $104 a barrel. A few hours ago, it was up to $106, but it's paired off slightly after the Iranian foreign minister said that the Straits of Hormuz was only shut to ships from enemies, which actually soothed some of the international shipping nerves. And 2 tankers carrying liquefied petroleum gas to India sailed through the strait, a route that normally handles around about a fifth of the world's oil supplies.
And the domestic consequences of the oil price rise will be the subject of this morning's press conference. The Prime Minister will set out details of plans to help those exposed to a sudden jump in heating costs. 1.5 million households, including 60% of homes in Northern Ireland, rely on heating oil, and this intervention will cost tens of millions at least, but it looks like there's more to come too. Ed Miliband, the Energy Secretary, giving suggestions yesterday of broader help for consumers, saying if it's necessary to intervene, we will if people's energy costs surge.
Yeah, it's really interesting and worth listening to the language here, because it hints at the politics of something that's going on below the surface. Touring the studios yesterday morning, Ed Miliband said, "We're going to stand by people in this crisis," and that the government was preparing for all eventualities. Now, all of that suggests that the kind of intervention that Ed Miliband was talking about was of a different order to what Rachel Reeves was hinting at when she appeared before a select committee in the middle of last week, where it could be more targeted. Ed Miliband said he was not going to let prices for consumers rise to the level that they were set at back in 2022 when the Ukraine crisis first happened. But of course, the oil price rises have been of a bigger order of magnitude than back then. So is he leaning towards something much bigger and much more costly, potentially, than Rachel Reeves is inclined, and the Treasury will be inevitably inclined to do? I have to say, Anne, there are people who think that we are simply living part of an Ed Miliband government in a funny way right at the moment. He's just a much bigger figure at the moment, since this government tilted much more strongly towards the sort of soft left sort of direction in politics. So I think where that argument goes is going to be a fascinating indicator of kind of where this government now places itself after so many different changes of direction. Quite where it comes out, I think, is one to watch. Those are all just options, however, at the moment, and we'll follow the debate inside government. The really difficult thing is knowing how big this crisis is ultimately, and that's all a question for global diplomacy.
The other aspect of Ed Miliband's speech that struck me on that front was his repetition of de-escalation as the desired stance for the UK on Iran. But that is not really for all of what we were talking about at the top of the podcast, with Keir Starmer making clear he's not just going to send a warship to the Gulf because Donald Trump asked him to. But nonetheless, de-escalation is not where we are now, and the UK has very little leverage on whether it could be. And if you look, Sam, at communications, I've been looking at it at the weekend in some detail for a piece I was working on, MOD communicating support for Gulf allies, a punchy video by the new ambassador to the US, Christian Turner, amping up the UK's input into the defence of the Gulf. And the fact is, we are drawn closer into this conflict if we are as much in the skies shooting down drones as missiles as we are. And I think there are about 300 sorties flown in the last period on that score. That gives you just a sense of it, even without warships getting involved. What I've explored in a piece for the Politico site today with two of my colleagues, Esther Webber and Sophie Inge, is what is the British stance here, and how does it fit with what the Gulf states expect from us? And some really senior people in conversations in government, in the military, told the three of us that British defensive actions in the region had been hobbled at the outset, and even in the run-up to this conflict, by a risk-averse stance from Starmer, from the National Security Advisor Jonathan Powell, from John Healey, Defence Secretary, and Yvette Cooper, because they feared a domestic backlash, and a lot of them thought that this had been wrong. We would have been in a stronger position to help our allies in the Gulf had we lent into this sooner. But that doesn't now appear to be the Prime Minister's position. So it's a little bit odd to try to figure out exactly how far we want to go in our defensive strategy.
Okay, that's actually fascinating because a lot of last week, and we were talking about the flak being taken by the relatively new chief of the defence staff, Richard Knighton, over the options he put before the Prime Minister, whether or not he was quick enough on the off the mark in the discussion about whether or not to send ships to the region, and all of that kind of thing. But as the sort of tit-for-tat blame game escalates at home, you're saying that really, if you want to put the responsibility for the slightly slow start to this conflict, it's actually at the blame for that should be put at the door of senior politicians who are a much bigger contributor to that.
That's certainly the view of a lot of people with some stripes and who've been in past conflicts, and many of whom do not want to see us, I should say, involved in offensive action against Iran. They're just questioning whether the defensive stance was strong enough. And one former commander talking to us said Number 10 was determined to downplay any risk or perception of us getting involved. So now we're playing catch up, and it means we showed up late. And this was the view of a number of people we spoke to, that it left a bit of a scramble in the Gulf, which fits with the barrage of sudden comms on that score, that we are there, our allies there principally being for Bahrain, for Kuwait, for Qatar, for UAE. And the MOD even put out a post telling everyone at the weekend how supportive we were being to those countries. But then you do come down to, if this is the analysis, that we should have been there earlier with ships and perhaps even with a submarine, and you now at this point have Keir Starmer saying, oh, it's too dangerous now. You could either say, Keir Starmer, that lean back position being criticised was correct all along, or you could say, which I think is at the angle of our story, if we'd been there a bit earlier, we may have played a bigger role in keeping the Straits of Hormuz open. So obviously the government strongly disagrees with this, I should say, but it would be wrong to say that this conversation is not taking place in a number of quarters, and including in the Gulf itself.
All of this is underlined by a sort of gamble that Number 10 look to me that they're making, that they think that the public will distinguish, as they do, a difference between the UK rejecting offensive military cooperating in offensive military endeavours versus taking part in defensive ones. Clearly, Britain has drones above the sky in activity that can be cast as defensive, but wants to make clear that it's not particularly involved in anything offensive. I'm not sure yet, and sort of time will tell whether or not the public is as willing to make the distinction that Downing Street would like them to between those two different things, so that Keir Starmer can take credit for not participating in the original raids while looking like he's doing everything he can to ease the economic situation. It's a difficult message to land, and I think in time we will find out. We will find out more.
I would just chip in, the people we were speaking to were talking about defensive action. None of them were talking about as being more offensive. It's the definition, you put your finger on it there, of what is defensive and what is offensive. You could send a warship and it would be defensive, but Keir Starmer is clearly saying that would be provocative. And what I think is kind of blurring away is this line: how can you hold it as Prime Minister, as Defence Secretary? This is defensive, so we're going to do it. But this might also be a good thing to do to defend the Straits, or it might not. But how do you make that distinction? It's not about being offensive. I think it's a sort of false choice that's been thrown up a bit.
It's also a big week in Europe and for Britain's relationship with Europe. Rachel Reeves is going to set it out tomorrow in her May's lecture, how the government is looking at more areas where we can deepen sort of relationships, deepen cooperation in the single market. Let's see how practical that ends up being. And I think Nick Thomas-Symonds has got more meetings this week. But it's also a big week in Europe itself.
It's a huge European Council on Friday, tussling with some of the issues that we've been talking about on the domestic front and the position of leading European countries. Sam, UN Secretary General is also going to be in town trying to shore up support in European capitals for the rules-based system, or what remains of it. For the UK, it's another of those moments when everybody is headed to Brussels to try to push for a summit date on that long-awaited EU reconnection we've talked about on the podcast since about 1848, which would be the moment the youth mobility scheme finally gets over the line, rebranded as the Youth Experience Scheme. One story The Guardian reported was a fly in the ointment over a standoff on tuition fees, the EU side pressing for students who would come to the UK in greater numbers to only pay the same fees as at home, and fees often lower in continental Europe. One source on our side on that one saying, yes, the EU signalled it wants home fees, but they've signalled that for a while. And likewise, we've signalled we won't move on it. So lots of Eurostar diplomacy going on over a push for the summit date. But as far, at least as I'm hearing, that change on fees would not be on the table. Will Nick Thomas-Simmons finally come back with a summit date? Please, Nick, let's just get on with it.
Just before we wrap up, a couple of things that are going on that are quite important that we shouldn't leave without just mentioning briefly. We're going to get a bit of a hint of the shape of future welfare reform, the Work and Pension Secretary, Pat McFadden. So in narrow terms, he's announcing a sort of fresh drive to reform the benefits system by promising businesses direct cash payments of £3,000 for each young person that they hire who's been on benefits and been trying to find a job for 6 months. But what seems to be the case is ministers are also discussing maybe creating a separate disability system for those aged between 16 and 24 and linking it to attempts to get a job. So sort of front-running the carrot end of the welfare reform in contrast to how they did it last year. But if the system is to change, rather like all the other difficult reforms like SEND, there's got to be some stick in there as well. So MPs will be evaluating that carefully.
Meanwhile, Keir Starmer is being asked to choose when it comes to assisted dying legislation. MP supporters of the assisted dying bill appear to have accepted what you reported a few weeks ago, Sam, that the bill will not make it through the Lords with only 3 more days scheduled to debate over 600 amendments. A letter to the PM from more than 100 Labour MPs sent this morning urging Starmer to ensure time is found for Parliament to come to a decision in the next session of Parliament.
I think for a lot of people at the heart of government to have that decision delayed to after May, which is a moment of intense vulnerability for Keir Starmer, if it all goes the way that we expect, is quite awkward. You know, you don't want to be on the wrong side of 100 Labour MPs on anything at that point in May. There are really 2 points this year, I think, where party politics will dominate. One is straight after the local elections, and the other, Anne, is when we head into conference season in late September, early October. So we'll be across both of those, particularly the second one where you've got some news.
A heads up from me if you're one of those organised folk who have your party conference diaries planned out now, respect. A sneak preview, the Politico pub is returning to Labour Party conference later this year. There will be speakeasies events as well at the Conservative, Liberal, Democrat and Reform gathering. So we hope to see a lot of you there. There will be the pints, the interviews, the encounters flowing on stage, and there'll be more details in our playbook today to wet your whistle.
Great. Well, we have just about hit the 20-minute mark. Let's see what the Prime Minister does this morning as he tries to steal a political march on his allies, but also give some reassurance about how the government's going to help. We will see you again tomorrow.
See you tomorrow.